Hello, welcome. Today I want to speak about a chapter in Carl Jung's collected works, volume 8, at least in the German version. It's entitled Die Dynamik des Unbewussten. I think the English translation is the dynamic. It's different. I think it's something the dynamic of the psyche, but I'm not 100% sure. In any case, the title of the chapter is Die psychologischen Grundlagen des Geisterglaubens, the psychological foundations of the belief in ghosts. It was actually published in. It's based on a talk he gave to the British Society for Psychical Research, and was published under the title "The Psychological Foundations of Belief in Spirits." And this is already a very fascinating, I think, distinction, because we have to, the German term that he used, ghost, Geist. It's the term. It means ghosts. Okay. It also means spirit, but spirit has a connotation, especially if you think of it in Hegelian terms, that I cannot reconcile with the fact that he does talk about haunting in the literal sense. He literally talks about ghosts. Okay, so when this translation or the title of this talk uses the word spirit, I want you to think of ghosts nonetheless. You know, even if you call them spirits, please also think of ghosts. Ghosts, not goats. Okay. In specific, I would like to focus in this talk on trauma and the autonomy of trauma. I would like to return to our discussion of the interaction between the unconscious and the conscious minds. I would like to, he gives a very vivid account in this chapter of psychic complexes and their interactions. Remember, we established in earlier videos the metaphorical framework where we spoke about a village as a metaphor for consciousness, and different elements, different houses in that village as different, relatively autonomous sections of that village. They're relatively autonomous units, families for that matter. They remain relatively independent from the central governing body of that village, although they are nonetheless undermined by the general narrative created by this centralized body. So, and this is, I had a conversation yesterday where, I was asked, so what really is this central governmental body doing? And I said, look, I think maybe, because the question came up in the context of a criticism of that metaphor, because if you think about this village in materialistic terms, you actually have a village that you can actually go to, and then you can look at all the places there. You could examine the entire structure of the village, and you could, as an external person, you could ultimately make up your own mind about what that village is, and you wouldn't be fooled by the tales told by this centralized governing body that we established last time as an element of consciousness, that there is a connecting narrative that gives linearity to the entire network of particulars, if you will, that are present in this town. And I said, look, the point is that you won't be able to go to the village because it's locked, right? It's guarded, and it's like you only will ever have contact with ambassadors that are sent from the central town hall to tell stories about the village. And those stories will be influenced by what actually is going on in the village. They can't be entirely fictional. But they are fictional to a very, very large degree. It's like a movie. A movie is always fictional. They're fictional in two senses, right? It's fictional because it's a story, but it's also fictional because you take certain angles, you take certain perspectives, you choose to show certain elements of what you film. So it's fictional in the sense that you film something that's not real, but it's also fictional in the sense that you film, right? And I think the ego is like that, right? The ego is fictional in the sense that there is a very specific representation that you're being presented with, the persona. But there's also the representational element, language, that calls for continuity, that calls for stability, that pretends to be eternal, but that's not eternal. I could say, if I ask you today, what will you do when, what will you do when you spill your tea, in the literal sense, because I have tea, you will say X, Y, Z, and then when you actually spill your tea, it will probably be something else. Okay. But anyway, so you assume permanence, but the reality is impermanence. So, why is this important? Because I want to emphasize again, and Jung emphasizes this in this chapter, that there is an autonomy in these different complexes that belong to the personal unconscious. And I'll be going through this chapter step by step, and it's not long, it's like 12 pages, or 15 or 20, I'm not sure. And when I'm quoting, I'll be directly translating. Well, I'll be reading the German, but I'll be speaking English. So I'll be directly translating from the German version in my own words. Hope that's okay. So he first, before I get to trauma, I'll skip ahead a little bit, and he speaks, because he gives incredibly clear definitions in this chapter of his conception of the personal and the unpersonal, so the collective unconscious. This is on page 340 and 41. And he says, it's actually very interesting because he does include in this is the first time I encounter it, he does include what we call the subconscious. So those sublime, he says, the sublime impressions or perceptions that will have too little energy in order to reach consciousness. And by that I think he literally means, light impulses that are not bright enough to be perceived by our perceptive organs. He includes that in the personal unconscious. He also again emphasizes that the personal unconscious includes those contents that prove to be incompatible with the conscious dominant or with the conscious attitude. The literal word is Einstellungen. Although I think, because he talks about complexes on the next page, I do believe that he would, we can translate this with complexes. So the personal unconscious has this element that there are certain incompatibilities. And he talks also of the repressed, again, as we've spoken about. What is the difference? So he says the collective unconscious also retains certain elements that are incompatible with the personal attitude. What is the difference? The difference is clearly, and not surprisingly, the collective nature, right? So he says that those are contents that do not belong to or are not associated with a single individual, but at least a group of individuals, often even an entire peoples, even all of humanity. And this is also an interesting aspect, I think, that we have to know about the collective unconscious. we often think of the collective unconscious as containing these, you know, large contents and that pertain to all of humanity. You know, they're sort of defining what we are as humans. And I think he quite rightly says that collective simply means not one, okay, more than one. And this becomes very important when we speak about trauma in a little bit, intergenerational trauma, how Jung thinks about this, and tap into, while speaking about this, into Jung's theory of the soul, which should sound familiar to anyone familiar with Plato. Jung says that we should not imagine these mythological motives that are recurring and present in the collective unconscious, that are often expressed as particular myths that may differ on the surface between different cultures. You know, this is the standard Jungian gesture, right? You have all these creation myths that talk about similar themes, you know, floods as an example. And this points towards an archetype that has a collective nature. And, you know, Jung says, and okay, while we have established just 2 minutes ago that this is not the only element of the collective unconscious, Jung nonetheless says that these schemas are to be understood literally as schemas. And he gives the example of the grid that that sort of gives a crystal. If you how do you say, you breed a crystal? I'm not sure if you say that, but if you make a crystal in the lab, you give it a grid that it can grow on, right? And a certain liquid that it grows in. And sort of these schemas are the determining the way that the crystal can unfold. So I think this fits very nicely with the metaphor of topography that I have introduced elsewhere in another video. So the collective unconscious in this way as topography of beings, as topography in which specific villages can unfold, and again as self-same topography, yet self-different topography, right? Each element of topography is present to varying extents in all topographies. Okay. So now let's get to this other element. Jung continues to speak about that there's an association between personal complexes and the ego. Okay, he says we experience them as strange, as foreign whenever they come up. And here in this context, he starts talking about or returning to ghosts and souls, and he differentiates between the soul, and the ghost or the spirit. For him, the spirit or the ghost, I will prefer to say ghost, because probably spirit would be better, but I'll prefer to say ghost. So the ghosts that haunt are, in his definition, related to the complexes of the collective unconscious. The souls that haunt, souls can also haunt, as we'll see in a second, that haunt the subject or the individual are associated with personal unconscious. Okay, and so now we'll get to his imagination of these elements. He thinks of, he suggests to attribute to each person a multitude of souls and a multitude of ghosts. He firstly mentions that those complexes, as he calls them, have autonomy. They're more or less associated with the subject. Even if they're more associated, they retain a certain level of autonomy. and they are more or less integrated. Here's a fun fact. Jung often speaks about differentiation of consciousness. In the process of individuation, you differentiate. That's also why I don't like individuation, because you differentiate, which technically means you become less whole. Because for him, and he says this on page 340, where he says that when, as is the case by differentiated people, as is almost always the case for differentiated people, a function, he talks about cognitive functions, what is today best known as the MBTI framework. A cognitive function, as for example thinking, is predominantly developed and therefore reigns consciousness. The subordinate or the other complementary function to that will be pushed into the background and less dominant in consciousness. So in this case, it will be feeling. So if you're if you're an extrovert thinker, your associated inferior function would be introverted feeling. And that if you now heavily differentiate, well, if you're heavily differentiated, your extroverted thinking will come into the foreground even more, and your introverted feeling will move into the background even more. Wholeness would mean the opposite, and we'll get to these problems in other conversations. For now, let's remain with spirit and ghosts. Spirits and souls. We've established that spirits or ghosts are associated with the collective unconscious. We've established that souls for Jung are associated with the personal unconscious. We've established that both retain a certain amount of autonomy. We've established the difference between collective and personal, where personal means having to do something with the individual's life span. Collective means having to do something with more than an individual's lifespan. Now, what's very interesting here is speaking about intergenerational trauma. It seems, this is my hypothesis here, that there is no real differentiation between collective and personal. It seems in this chapter, as I read it, that everything is collective. Jung says on page 334 that ancestry cults are of any kind. Okay, so the belief that you should tame your ancestors, keep them out of your life, keep them at bay, and are often associated with the predomination of certain, or associated to keep at bay certain predominations of diseases that run in families, for example, or certain fates that haunt a family, intergenerational traumas. So what are these elements, right? Are they personal? They're associated with one individual in this life. Are they collective? They have the autonomy to travel from one life to the next. He says that the soul of a living person after their death becomes the ghost haunting another. I think this is a very interesting piece of evidence for that I've been arguing for a while, that the individual in their lives exercise an influence in the collective, shape the collective, You know, you have to wonder, and this is again, we're not going to get into this in depth today, but you have to wonder if, so you have to wonder a few things. Where do souls come from? What are they made of? What's their material? Is there a finite number of material? An infinite number of material? If souls become ghosts, can ghosts also become souls? Can a soul stay a soul? Yeah. Can a soul disappear? Do they always have to become ghosts? He speaks of psychological or psychic fragments that survive. What happens to the other fragments that don't survive? Do they just cease to be? Are they transformed? Merged? He says that inspiration is almost always the rupture, the encounter of such an autonomous complex. By autonomous complex, I mean a ghost, a spirit, a soul. Because you see, if we now keep talking about this, the differentiation doesn't really make sense, does it? It seems to be that a soul is only a ghost trapped in one way or another in the network of what we have defined as consciousness. What Jung would then define as the personal unconscious in this context. He has other contexts where that becomes obsolete, and I think there's reason enough to believe that it's obsolete. Everything there is from the perspective of us, conscious speaking subjects. Everything there is consciousness. From the perspective of being, everything there is collective unconscious. It's the fabric that consciousness is made of. The illusion of consciousness. Because what remains? Look, you see what remains? What remains is that central town hall, standing there, telling a story that gives it the fiction, or affords it the fiction of being alive, affords it the fiction of sending an ambassador somewhere to tell a story of itself. While at home, there's anarchy, right? It can barely be kept at bay. Jung says that as soon as the contents of the collective unconscious become alive, in ritual, in ecstasy, free association, creative acts, sexual acts, acts where representation is obsolete, a certain confusion arises then. And if this rise of the collective is motivated or preceded by the breakdown of the boundaries of the ego, or he calls it Lebenshoffnung, so the will to maintain continuity, to maintain life, the hope for life, Lebenshoffnung, but what is continuity, and especially if it's fictional, then hope. What is life from the perspective of consciousness, then hoping that tomorrow is like today, that tomorrow my assumptions will hold true, that tomorrow I won't break down, because tomorrow will be similar enough to today for me to function. But if the rise of collective contents is preceded by the breakdown of the walls of the ego, he says that if that happens, there's a danger that the unconscious will take the place of the conscious ordering mind, which is interesting. We will have to talk about this. What would happen? Does that work? Can you live a life without the ego? Does it work? In any case, what is important to notice is that the encounter with these complexes has a rupturing effect on this narrative. He talks about this a lot in the Mysterium Conjunctionis, part 2. And it's always important to note that there is this tension between the town hall trying to maintain order and the unconscious complexes, those spirits, those ghosts they're not actively trying, they're just there. That's also an important point to note. It's not like they want to destroy, but they destroy because they're ignored, because they're subjugated, their autonomy is threatened, and they prevail. Consciousness ceases. So I hope this has given you some overview over this chapter. We'll return to it. I think it's an important one. And we'll also return to the Mysterium Conjunctionis, as it has some important implications also for our conception of the self. Thank you.